by the time 1900 rolls around, look how far that number drops. That drops to just below 240,000 people, right? That is a significant drop in population. If we look at 1990, it goes up to just under 2 million, so we do make a comeback, but we're still not that 112 million that we were prior to. In 2013, we're around 5.2 million. And in 2021, our numbers are just under 10 at 9.7 million people. That is just 2% of the people population in the United States. So a continent that, in a country that we once called our own, that housed hundreds upon hundreds of indigenous nations, we are now only 2% of that population on our own land. And I'll even take that one step further, that the indigenous land in the United States that is recognized by the federal government, so the reservations, is only 2% of the land population in the United States. If you took all the reservations and rancheras and communities and all of that and you put them into one state, they would all fill the state of Idaho. That's not a lot. We have a lot of land in this country, and only 2% of it is considered indigenous land or Indian country, and no tribe actually holds the deed to their land. That deed is held in trust by the federal government. And so this, how did we get there? Well, this is a really interesting map, and I really like it because, number one, it moves, right? So it helps my ADHD. It's like it's moving, and I can see everything that's going on. So this map begins in 1794, and it shows the tribal lands marked first in color and then in green as it continues to move along. In 1795, the U.S. and Spain signed the Treaty of San Lorenzo, carving up much of the continent between them. What followed was a century of catastrophes for indigenous people, as their land was taken piece by piece. And by the time the U.S. passed the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act, in 1887, effectively abolishing tribal governments and forcing assimilation, there was little to no land left for indigenous folks. European settlers in North America found it with diverse, long-established societies. They may have become sovereign nation-states had the settlers, and later the United States, not sought to purge them from their lands, deny them self-rule, and once they had reduced indigenous folks to a tiny minority, forcibly assimilate them and their land. These acts are the foundation upon which the United States, as we know it, was built. And that is something that's not the most pleasant thing to hear, but it's the truth. The United States was built on stolen land, and we have to acknowledge that. That's fact. That's not me putting my own spin on it. That's just absolute fact. There were people living here prior to colonization, and that's something that we have to talk about and we have to acknowledge. And so I like to start out with this because we can talk about the American Revolution and the French and Indian War and all these other things, but none of it makes sense if you don't understand that every single fight was about land. It's always, at the center of any conflict is about land. Look what's happening in the world today. It's all about land, and so that's important. Land is sacred. Land is living. Land is breathing. Land is our relative. And so that is something that I want to stress very much to people. So, as a historian, there's something I like to do. I can't talk to you about a certain event without you having a backstory first. You have to know what's going on. You have to understand how we got to a certain place. Everything that happens, in the past leads to where we are right now in 2024. And so in order to understand Pontiac's rebellion and why it happened, we have to understand how we got to the need for Pontiac to have a rebellion. So we're going to first talk about the French and Indian War, which is actually not a war that I talk about a lot, but it's actually a very important moment in history, particularly in the history of the founding of the United States. You wouldn't think it would be, but there's a lot that goes on in the French and Indian War that leads to the start of the American Revolution and the formation. So that's where we're going to get to, and Pontiac is part of that. So in Europe, the French and Indian War is known as the 7 Years' War. This was a conflict between France and Britain on who would have imperial power around the world. When France expanded into the Ohio River Valley, the conflicts between Britain and France grew. Now, prior to that, historically, France and Great Britain never liked each other. They were consistently fighting, and this just got worse, bad, harder, I don't know, when colonization here started. So borders were not well defined between the British and the French colonies. The question was who was going to have control over North America? And we're not just talking about the United States either. We're talking about Canada as well. Canada's part of that. East of the Mississippi River was claimed by either France or Great Britain, and it excluded the indigenous tribes that called the area home for millennia. This led to several conflicts, with the British declaring war in 1756. The war lasted from 1756 to 1763. In the early 1750s, France expanded into the Ohio River Valley. In 1754, the French built a fort in modern-day Pittsburgh as a stronghold that the British repeatedly attacked. And between 1754 and 1755, the French repeatedly beat the British, defeating George Washington, General Edward Braddock, and Governor William Shirley repeatedly. Later on, George Washington does end up gaining some victories during the French and Indian War because he's actually known as a big war hero during this time. And that actually is what helps propel him to be the commander of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. So he gets his bones here. This is where we get to know him a little bit more. Also, I really want to point out that it is also during this time that George Washington inherits a name from the Seneca people, and he inherits the name Town Destroyer. And the reason I say he inherits it because his grandfather had it before him. So just like to go in, destroy towns, destroy indigenous villages. And so now George Washington is doing the same exact thing. So now he gets that name, and he carries that name for the rest of his life. He almost carries it as a badge of honor, which is really interesting and weird to me because you're going in and destroying the towns that these people were living in. And later, he's honored as the first president of the United States, and then we had put him on Mount Rushmore. So there's a whole bunch of things we could dissect there, but we would have to have hours for that. So he gets his reputation during the French and Indian War. War, again, was officially declared in 1756. There's a lot of losses that were faced. In 1757, the tide of the war changes when William Pitt, the new British leader, looked at the conflicts as a way to build the British Empire. So it's like, we could get more land, we could become stronger, we could become bigger, so let's go ahead and engage this a little bit harder. So when the British see that this is a war of conquest instead of just protection, it changes the mindset of the soldiers. So that's absolutely where it goes. There were native nations that fought in this war, obviously, because it is called the French and Indian War. So many tribes allied with the French to keep the British at bay. In the opinion of the tribes, the French caused less strife than the British, who were bringing their wives and families over. The French were marrying indigenous women and living among the tribes. So there is a different set and lifestyle that's going on here. The British are coming over, they're bringing their own families, they're bringing British women, marrying them, starting their own families, and encroaching on indigenous land, where the French are actually trying to be part of the indigenous community. This does not justify colonization in any way, shape, or form, but they're not causing as much pain. There were 1.5 million British colonists on the East Coast from Nova Scotia to Georgia. That is a lot. There were only about 75,000 French. So we can see that there is a huge difference in who is colonizing the area. So it was critical for the French to gain support of native nations. On the side of the British, you have the Haudenosaunee, of which I am part of, the people of the Longhouse, and they include the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, and the Tuscarora. And then the Cherokee also join on the side of the British as well. This is interesting because this allyship changes when the revolution starts. And so everything switches. On the side of the French, you had the Abenaki, the Algonquin, other Algonquin-speaking tribes, the Lenape, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, the Shawnee, and the Wyandot. So there's a lot that goes on. There's a lot that's happening. Basically, what it comes down to is the tribes that sided with the French thought if they can help the French stay in control, they are not going to lose as much land, because the French, again, have kind of been staying off to themselves or marrying into the nations where the British come in, and they're bringing down the hammer really, really hard, and they don't want to have to deal with that. So the war goes on for a number of years. Eventually, we get a treaty. This is the Treaty of Paris of 1763, not to be confused with the Treaty of Paris that ends the American Revolution. There's two. So this is the one that we're talking about. We're talking about 1763. So in 1762, King Louis XV of France, and I was like, he's King Louis XV. They couldn't have found another name to name their children. Everyone's named Louis. So he starts to call for peace talks. The British government is also interested in peace talks. Why? Because the war is becoming very expensive. War is very expensive. And they are a huge empire, and they are having to cross oceans to help fund this war. So a French negotiator proposed to redistribute the land in North America. British would gain all French territory east of the Mississippi. Spain would keep Cuba in exchange for handing Florida to the British. French territories west of the Mississippi would go to Spain. France would, along with some of the territory in Africa, would regain the Caribbean islands. The British promised to allow French Canadians to continue to practice Catholicism and provide fishing rights for the French off of Newfoundland. I've never known how to say it. The Treaty of Paris of 1763 ends the 7 Years' War, ends the French and Indian War in the colonies, and it is signed February 10th, 1763 in Paris, thus the name the Treaty of Paris. According to the terms, France gives up almost all of its controls in mainland North America, which end a foreign threat to the British colonies that were there, because we have the 13 colonies already there. Due to the provisions in the treaty and the tribal nations that had been fighting on the side of the French, the treaty was a considerable loss. They were going to lose control over their land and didn't have an ally to back them anymore. The French had lost. It was done. It was over. The territory of Louisiana was transferred from France to Spain. France later regains control of the area in 1800, but it doesn't remain in French hands very long, because shortly after Jefferson takes office, we have something called the Louisiana Purchase. And in all honesty, so I actually talked about this when I was down at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, because my talk there was about Indian removal, but it was about how Jefferson actually opened the door for Jackson to do what he did because of the Louisiana Purchase. And so when Jefferson gets the idea, or the idea is brought to him to purchase this large tract of land that basically takes the United States all the way to the Pacific coast, it's because, this is where we can put the Indians. We can get them out of this area that we're already in and have civilized, and we can just move them over there. So that's really a big reason as to why Jefferson does the Louisiana Purchase. And Jackson writes about it later on when he's talking about Indian removal in 1830. So that there's a really big connection, and if you're interested in Jefferson and Jackson, I really encourage you to look at them together, because there is so much parallel that's happening, because they're both doing the same thing. They're talking about expanding the United States, but they're also talking about dealing with, quote, the Indian problem. So it's very fascinating. I went down so many rabbit holes, and I could do so many talks about I could talk about Jackson all day long. I don't like him, but he's fascinating, right? He's just a weird character. And being at the Hermitage was also very interesting. The minute I entered his house, it was like this heaviness just came over me. And then being in his library, and then you can go into his bedroom. Well, I got to go into his bedroom. You don't get to go into his bedroom. I got to go into his bedroom. And, he died in that room, and I was like, oh, this is so weird. And then they have, a pair of his slippers on the floor, and I was like, for some reason, the slippers creeped me out. But it's all right. But look at Jefferson and Jackson together. I digress. So the Mississippi River, except for New Orleans, sets the British boundary, okay? So New Orleans is kind of its own little thing, but it does become part of this new territory when we get the Louisiana Purchase. The dynamic between Native nations and colonists after signing this treaty is changing, because now we're just dealing with British colonists, and we're dealing with the settlers and colonists that were already there, and now we're under the rule of the crown. So there's a lot of things that are happening. There's a lot of things that are changing, and you've got the colonists who are not supposed to be leaving a certain area, and they start to leave a certain area. And Pontiac starts to get worried that if they keep encroaching westward, what's going to happen to us? Where are we going to go? What is going to happen of our lands? So to prevent this, Pontiac, who was an Odawa chief, allies with several other tribes to attempt to drive the British out. This is known as Pontiac's Rebellion. So the British end the uprising, but they wanted to prevent further conflicts with the tribe, so they issue something called the Proclamation of 1763. And we'll talk about that in a little later on, but I want to talk to you more about Pontiac's rebellion. So in 1763, Pontiac leads a surprise attack against the British in Detroit and other British forts in the Great Lakes area, from Fort Edward Augustus in Wisconsin to Fort Isle in Pennsylvania. The conflict involves the British on one side, with Pontiac leading the Odawa, Lenape, Potawatomi, Shawnee, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, Huron, Choctaw, Kickapoo, and Peoria peoples. That is a lot. He forms like this little confederacy of all these tribes that come together. So the conflict, the rebellion, originates in the Great Lakes region, but it quickly spreads as far as Illinois in the west and as far as Virginia in the east. So this is a big, if you look at a map, which I had one up earlier, but if you look at that map and you think about how far Illinois is and then how far Virginia is, that's a vast territory, everything in between, right? So of course, settlers who are in the area or British soldiers who are in the area are going to be a little worried about what's going on. So in 1762, Pontiac enlisted support from just about every tribe from Lake Superior to the lower Mississippi to remove the British from the previously occupied territory. Remove them. The plan was that each tribe would take control of the fort that was closest to them. So whatever fort was close to you, so if Fort Detroit or Fort Detroit was closest to you, that was going to be the fort you were going to go to, and so on and so forth. So in April of 1763, Pontiac convenes a war council on the banks of the Ecorse River near Detroit. So I think when we think about Detroit and history of Detroit, we think a lot about French and fur trading, but we don't realize there was a really rich indigenous history in the area and Great Lakes region prior to all of that. So when I'm reading about these things and I'm thinking about these things, or I'm even driving past these things, because I live downtown and I'll drive past this one historical marker. It was the home of a house that was on the Underground Railroad. And I'm like, this is history happening right here in my backyard. And then my husband proceeds to call me a nerd. And I'm like, yes, that is who you married. So there we go. So when I'm thinking Ecorse River near Detroit, I'm like, that's so amazing. That's right there. So it was decided that Pontiac and his warriors would gain access to the British fort at Detroit under the pretense of negotiating a peace treaty, allowing them to seize the arsenal there forcibly. But British Major Henry Gladwin learns of this plot, and the British were ready when Pontiac arrives in early May. And Pontiac was forced to begin the siege faster than what he had anticipated. At the same time, his allies in Pennsylvania began a siege at Fort Pitt, while other sympathetic tribes such as the Lenape, the Shawnee, and the Seneca prepared to move against various British forts and outposts in Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. And I have to tell you, I lived in New York for about a year and a half. I had the honor of living in the homelands for a year and a half. That's where my ancestors come from. And they are all about, you can't drive down the road in New York, especially upstate. So if you leave the city and you go upstate about 2 hours, you can't drive down the road or walk down the road without hitting a historical marker. They're everywhere. And there are so many different forts in different areas. If you drive up near Lake George, you can actually see Fort William Henry. It's a reproduction of Fort William Henry, not super far off from where the original fort was. And that was an important fort during the French and Indian War. You go a little further north, and there's all these other forts. So there's so much history that's happening there. Also in Pennsylvania, because I was in Pennsylvania earlier too, And this history is super, super rich, but they don't really like talk about it a lot. And I think it's because so much of it is lost. And so that's what I'm hoping with the work that I do, is that we talk about these histories. So Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia all had forts there that fell or were attacked under Pontiac's rebellion. On July 31st, a British relief expedition attacked Pontiac's camp, but suffered heavy losses and were repelled in the Battle of Bloody Run. But they had succeeded in providing the fort at Detroit with reinforcements, supplies, which allowed it to hold out against the indigenous folks into the fall. The principal forts at Fort Pitt and Fort Niagara likewise held on, but the United Tribes captured 8 other fortified posts. So they didn't capture Detroit, they did not capture Fort Pitt, and they did not capture Fort Niagara, but a bunch of other ones did fall. At these forts, the garrisons were wiped out, relief expeditions were repulsed, and nearby frontier settlements were destroyed. In the spring of 1764, 2 British armies were sent out, one into Pennsylvania and Ohio under Colonel Bruegl, and the others under the Great Lakes under Colonel John Bradstreet. Bruegl's campaign succeeded, and the Lenape and the Shawnees were forced to sue for peace, breaking Pontiac's alliance. Failing to persuade the tribes in the west to join his rebellion, so further west, think of the Plains area, and lacking the hoped for the support of the British, Pontiac finally signed a treaty with the British in 1766. In 1769, he was murdered by a Peoria person while visiting Illinois. His death led to bitter warfare among the tribes, and the Peorias were nearly wiped out. The offensive overall, Pontiac's rebellion overall, was mostly successful. Again, in June of 1763, there were only 3 forts that remained, and one of them was right here in Detroit. So the reason that Pontiac had this rebellion is after the French and Indian War, they were very worried about settlement moving westward into this land that was already theirs. So what was going to stop them from doing that? Before and during Pontiac's rebellion, the British were working on something called the Proclamation of 1763. The purpose of the proclamation was to stabilize the relationship between the colonists and the indigenous peoples. After the French and Indian War, the Crown started to tighten control that they had on the colonies in America. The land west of Appalachia was home to indigenous peoples, many of whom had already been removed from New England, my ancestors included, and they now found themselves under the British flag. The British also inherited the alliances that had been made when indigenous people, did someone sneeze? Bless you. They inherited the alliances that had been made with indigenous peoples and the French, but they were not sure what to do with them. Are these indigenous folks subjects of the crown? Are they independent nations? Well, according to Jeffrey Amherst, the Governor General in North America, said that indigenous people, quote, were the vilest race of beings that ever infested the earth, and that he was, quote, fully convinced the only true method of treating those Indians is to keep them in proper subjugation, end quote. So nice. He discontinued many practices that had been in place with the French, including gift giving, which was culturally significant because it helped seal political relationships. It's different the way the Europeans did it, but this is how indigenous folks did it, and the French adopted it, and so they're like, we're going to do this together. These acts, in addition to the colonists encroaching westward, broke any possibility of an alliance between the indigenous peoples and the crown. The rebellion that led to the proclamation of 1763, something that had been in the works, but Pontiac's rebellion made the proclamation happen faster. The proclamation, what it did is it did a couple of things. It shut down any settlement past the Appalachian Mountains, called the Proclamation Line. You cannot go past this area. And when I was leaving Nashville, driving up to Philadelphia, the road, I can't remember what highway we were on, but we were driving basically along the Proclamation Line because I happened to look over I was in the past. I'm a passenger princess. I don't like to drive very long. So I happened to look over to my left, and I saw a ridge line, and I'm like, huh, I wonder if that's what I think it is. And so, being the nerd that I am, pulled up my phone, and I looked at the proclamation line, and I looked at my Apple Maps as to where we were, and I'm like, here we are. I go, we are driving right along the proclamation line. And of course, I got super excited about that. So you can't settle past that. It also prevented any private citizen and colonial government from buying land or making any agreement with Indigenous people. In a very weird way, the Proclamation of 1763 was a very weird form of land back. You can't settle over here. This is Indigenous land. Leave it alone. You stay over here. So in a weird, strange way, Indigenous folks were kind of getting their land back. Not in the way we talk about it now, but in a weird way it kind of worked. In 1767, George Washington, who was a very passionate land speculator, predicted that the proclamation would be repealed in a few years. And while adjustments were made to the boundary line by the British, the proclamation continued to be in effect. Compromises, including the enforcement of the proclamation line of 1763, became revolutionary, as well as a rallying cry for independence. The Treaty of Paris redrew the boundary lines for the colonies and added new territories that were off limits to the colonists. Pontiac's rebellion toppled more than the military officers of the British. It crumbled the somewhat fragile stability between the crown and the colonists. So the French and Indian War happens. You got the Treaty of Paris that happens. You have the Proclamation line, an agreement that happens. And you have Pontiac's rebellion all happening at the same exact time. And the colonists are starting to question what the crown is doing. And that relationship becomes very, very fragile. And then they do a bunch of other things, right? So the British borrowed a lot of money to help finance the wars that they were having, and it doubled the British debt. So how do you get rid of the debt? Well, King George argued that since the war benefited the American colonies were going to have to pay for it. So in 1760, the population of the colonies reaches 1 million people. In 1764, you have the Sugar Act, which increased taxes on sugar, molasses, coffee, wine, and cloth. In 1764, you have the Currency Act, which bans the printing of paper money by colonial legislatures. It establishes a system based on the pound, and it makes it illegal to create or issue paper bills or bills of credit. And it sets fines and penalties for colonial government members who violates this act. In 1765, you have something called the Stamp Act. It required colonists to pay a tax on many different types of paper, including legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, dice, and playing cards. And I think it's also important that it should be noted that what the Crown was doing is they were imposing tariffs on the colonists. So that is the definition of a tariff. In 1770, you have the Boston Massacre, where 5 people die, the first of which is Crispus Attucks, who was of Afro and Indigenous descent. In 1773, you have the Boston Tea Party, where colonists dress up as Mohawk Indians and throw tea into the harbor. And 15 years after the French and Indian War, with the French still being slightly bitter, they aid the American colonies in a fight against Great Britain. And what ultimately happens is, while many tribal nations fight for the colonists, my ancestors included, after the war is over, we're removed off of our lands. Eventually, we're placed onto reservations. Eventually, our children are taken from us and sent to boarding schools. And we only end up making up 2% of the population in the United States on the land that we call home. So what Pontiac was doing was fighting for us to remain here, to remain people, to have an existence. And all of these things lead to a war for independence of a group of people who were mad because they couldn't cross over the Appalachian Mountains because somebody told them no. If you like reading, I really encourage you to get the following books on the screen. They're really great. By the Fire We Carry is by Rebecca Nagel. It's amazing. It's also available in audiobook if you like listening to your books. This book particularly talks about Indian removal, the rediscovery of America, and I'm sorry, Rebecca is Cherokee Nation. The rediscovery of America by Ned Blackhawk is an amazing book. It's pretty thick, but it's really, really good. The 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah Jones actually talks about Pontiac's rebellion, talks about the Proclamation Line, and talks about Indian removal. There's a lot in there. Indigenous history and Black history are interwoven. They're together. A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn needs to be required reading in every single school, though I doubt we will see that happen. And an Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is a history of the United States through an Indigenous lens. And so we talked about a lot of different things, but there was one main cause, and that main cause was land. That main cause was the fight for the land, for the existence of Indigenous folks, and how it ultimately led to the birth of a nation and the stifling of many, many others. So if I forget to say it afterwards, thank you so much for coming out to spend a Tuesday night with me. I hope you come back in January. And with that, I will open it up to any questions about anything we talked about tonight, any question you might have about Indigenous history in general. But I thank you so much, and I am grateful to you.
And I have a mic for questions.
This is just to clarify some family history. What fort is closest to Mansalona?
To where?
Mansalona, Michigan.
Would that be Michilimackinac?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And was that involved? How was that involved?
It was one of the forts that was part of Pontiac's rebellion. I think that fort actually fell. I focused more on Detroit and the East Coast, but thank you. Yeah. No questions off limits. If I don't know something, I will tell you I don't know.
So, where was Pontiac's original area that he lived in with his people, his village?
It was the Great Lakes region more so. So he was Odawa, and their region would have been Michigan, Detroit area, and then kind of up north a little bit. So the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe people in this area make up the Three Fires Council, and so he would have been part of that. Yeah, thank you. You're welcome.
There's a city north of Detroit called Pontiac. Is that named after Chief Pontiac?
It is, not the car. It is. It's named for Chief Pontiac, yeah. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Are we all worried that the fact it's 60 degrees outside? I am.
I know Pontiac had made connections with quite a few other tribes that fought with him. I was wondering the Miami tribe, how that connection happened, if you know.
So in the reading that I was doing, I didn't see them directly related to the rebellion itself, but the Miami originally from the Ohio area. They were removed to Oklahoma Indian Territory at the time. They do still have a strong connection to the land in Ohio. There's I can't remember what city it is. There's a university there. It's not Bowling Green. It's not. I want to say yes, but I also feel like that's like wrong for some reason, but I don't, only because it seems so obvious. But but there is a reciprocal relationship between the university and the Miami tribe in Oklahoma, where there's like tuition assistance and things like that. So they still have a lot of relationship, but they were removed shortly. I mean, all the tribes in the Ohio area, Ohio River Valley area, were removed shortly after the Louisiana Purchase, so early, that was in 1803, so it would be early 1800s. After Lewis and Clark came back and they were like, oh, this is all this area, they started moving people out of that area sooner. Most everybody was moved out of that area by 1830, and in the southeastern part of the United States when Andrew Jackson signed Indian removal. And actually, after Jackson signed Indian removal from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean in the southeastern part of the United States, with the exception of the Seminole, there were no indigenous tribes there. Later tribes ended up going back because we have Cherokee Nation, we have Eastern Band of Cherokee in North Carolina, so some ended up going back. But I mean, Indian removal was instrumental in moving a lot of people out of there. The Lenape people, who started in New York, ended up in Ohio, Indiana, all of that, were removed like 7 times, and one of their stops was actually in Ohio and then in Indiana. So a lot of people were moved out right afterwards, after the United States started expanding westward because they won the revolution, so now they can do whatever the heck they want. Any other questions?
I actually first heard about Pontiac, like the historical figure, in my Michigan history class in college. And low key, like after I heard about him, he was kind of like a superhero. Because like that was wild. I don't know if I missed it. Did you talk about his failed siege on Fort Detroit?
I mentioned it. I didn't go into detail.
That when she went into detail on that, that was like one of my favorite things I ever learned. But the part, like literally, and they had me in class, like I was watching, like, I don't know, like Real Housewives, because like literally, she was talking about when, what was it? It was the part when one of the indigenous women that was sleeping with a colonist was pillow talking, and that's how they found out about it. I was like, no way. I literally felt like I was watching Real Housewives.
History can be very dramatic.
But
like
no.
It is like reality TV.
I didn't just grab the microphone to say that. I just grabbed it to actually say, like, I don't know, like, do you think that history should be taught as it is, where it's just gross and dry and this happened, or do you think that there's a place for, like, making it dramatic? Because that is just, it's suited for drama. It's like, literally, like I said, it's like Real Housewives.
Right, yeah, no. So I have a lot of issues with the way that we do teach history. I think when we teach more inclusive narratives, that's where it gets really interesting, right? When we include, so history is really taught from a white Eurocentric point of view. I'm just saying that. I said it, I stand by it. But when we add in the other narratives, when we add in indigenous narratives, women, enslaved, free black, it gets way more interesting, right? When we talk about how, George Washington being, being known as town destroyer, that makes it more interesting. When we talk about these people just being actual people, instead of these creatures of myth that we make them out to be, to me, that's where it gets more interesting, because you're getting down to the essence of who someone is. And yeah, history is facts, but it's also analyzing who people were and what made them tick, and thinking about like why are they doing this or why are they doing that. And besides Jackson, one of my most favorite people to talk about is Jefferson, because that man was a walking, talking contradiction. He writes these amazing words, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights of those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it was a certain group of people, right? Didn't include women. And he was a slave holder. He owned people. He had and I very much say this and argue this, an unconsensual relationship, with Sally Hemings, and she bore his children, and his children he didn't recognize his children, and all of this other things. And so when we get down to the essence of who these people are, that makes it more interesting. That makes it seem like an episode of Real Housewives. And I actually, in my day job, wrote a series of articles, because I don't know if you guys know, but we had an election this year. And I wrote a series of articles about other contentious elections in the United States. And it's so interesting, because the first election that I thought of that was contentious, a lot of people go back to like 1860, right? They're thinking Lincoln, Douglas. Like, no, you gotta go back to 1800. You gotta go back to 1800 when Adams and Jefferson were running against each other, because they were besties. And then they had a falling out during Adams' presidency, and Jefferson goes off to Monticello, but he hires a journalist. At this point, I would say like National Enquirer guy, and he pays him to like write really awful things about Adams in the newspaper. Like, it's scandalous, y'all, like for real. And so he like pays him to do this. Now he's vice president of the United States at the time when he's doing this, right? But he's off in Monticello doing his own thing because, you know, Adams and him, you know, they're button heads. And so he pays this guy to start, you know, James Callender, look him up, amazing writer, wrote really awful things, all because Jefferson was paying him to do that. So when they have the election, and this was before your president and vice presidential candidate ran on the same ticket. Before, it was literally this person came in first place and their president, and this person came in second place and their vice president, which is how Adams and Jefferson ended up on the same administration. And so it was going to be Jefferson Burr. Aaron Burr was going to be vice president, but nobody got enough votes. So the election goes to the House of Representatives, and they have like a bajillion votes in the House, right? And Jefferson goes to Adams and says, bro, can you help me out? Like, what's going on? Like, we need to get this charged. And Adams is like, do you not think I know what you did? You cost me the presidency. I ain't lifting a damn finger to help you out, man. And it's like drama. Like, it is a reality TV show. And so it's like, that makes history so interesting. And I'm like, y'all think this is bad. Look at this. And so there's so many things that we could be talking about there. I mean, eventually they like make up and become besties again later on after they both leave office. And their letters are really interesting back and forth to each other. You should read them if you want to. And so I do think when we talk about history in a real fashion and we make these people real like they are and not mythical creatures, it does kind of become like a reality TV show and way more interesting. So I think that's how we should teach history. That's how my uncle taught me history. He made it real for me. And then I just started, going on my own and studied it in school and was like, oh my God, this is so interesting. But even when I think about Indigenous history, I think about people like Geronimo. Man, that dude was like hardcore. And like all these other warriors, and it's just so interesting. And so, yeah, I do think we should teach it in a way that makes it real and brings it alive and just makes it way more interesting.
I've got two more.
Okay, yeah, two more.
60 years ago, my brother was at Eastern, and they had ROTC, and he had to write a paper, and he wrote it about the Vale of Tears, and he got thrown out of ROTC because of telling the truth. So we had issues of critical race theory back then and, actual things that the military had done. We don't want the truth here, son.
Yeah, oh my gosh. That makes me like so mad for him.
After the American Revolution, there was another indigenous uprising that spread into the Great Lakes, right? Widespread. Tecumseh, these people?
Tecumseh did lead a pan-Indian group of indigenous folks that had an uprising just before the War of 1812. And he helped to try to convince tribal nations to fight on the side of the British this time to push the Americans out. I like to think of the War of 1812 as the Second American Revolution because there was a lot that happened there. But yeah, it's interesting. The tribes that fought on the side of the colonists during the American Revolution flipped and fought on the side of the British during the War of 1812 because the British were making them promises, and Tecumseh did help lead that. Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Good night. Thank you so much, Heather. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.